Basic Economics, A Common Sense Guide to the Economy, by Thomas Sowell. Introduction. Imagine for a moment a city in crisis. It's the 1940s, and across America, families are struggling to find a place to live. In New York City, the problem is especially dire. People are sleeping in garages, living in converted trolley cars, doubling up with relatives in cramped quarters. The newspapers are filled with stories of a desperate housing shortage. Now, you might think this shortage was caused by a war, or a disaster that destroyed thousands of buildings. But here's the strange part: there was no less housing space per person than there had been just a few years earlier, when there was no shortage at all. The buildings were still standing. The apartments were still there. So what happened? What invisible force was causing so much misery, leaving people homeless even when homes were available? The answer, it turns out, was a law. A well-intentioned law designed to help people, to make housing more affordable by controlling the rent landlords could charge. Yet, this attempt to help created a disaster. It's a story that has repeated itself, from Cairo to Stockholm, from ancient Rome to modern-day Zimbabwe. And it reveals a powerful, hidden truth about the world: that our best intentions, without a clear understanding of how things actually work, can lead to consequences we never imagined. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on these hidden forces. We're going to explore a book that has been a guiding light for millions, a book with no graphs, no equations, and no jargon, just profound, crystal clear common sense. We are diving into Basic Economics by the brilliant Thomas Sowell. Sowell is not just an economist, he is one of the great thinkers of our time. A man who started his life in poverty during the Great Depression, who left home in his teens, and who built a life of extraordinary intellectual achievement. He writes with a clarity that comes from a deep understanding of not just numbers, but of people, history, and human nature. And his promise in this book is simple, yet profound. He believes that the fundamental principles of economics are not hard to understand. And once you do understand them, the world will never look the same again. So, if you've ever wondered why some countries are rich and others are poor, why some businesses thrive while others fail, or why well-meaning policies so often backfire, then stay with me. Because by the end of our journey today, you will have a new lens through which to see the world. You will understand the powerful, invisible logic that shapes our lives, and you will be armed with the common sense to see through the fog of political rhetoric and media noise. This isn't just about economics, it's about learning to think. Book summary. Let's start with the most fundamental idea in all of economics, the one that explains almost everything else. It's a simple word: scarcity. What does that mean? It just means there isn't enough of anything to satisfy all our desires. Think about the Garden of Eden. It was a paradise where everything was available in unlimited abundance. But because there was no scarcity, there was no need to economize. And therefore, there was no economics. We, however, do not live in the Garden of Eden. In our world, everything is limited. Time, resources, energy, a spot on the beach, you name it. And this single, simple fact forces us to make choices. Trade-offs. This is the heart of economics, the study of how we use scarce resources that have alternative uses. That's it. That's the foundation. And from this one idea, everything else flows. If resources are scarce, then every society, whether it's capitalist, socialist, feudal, or a tribe in the Amazon, has to answer a few basic questions. What do we produce? How do we produce it? And who gets what is produced? In a feudal kingdom, the lord of the manor just tells everyone what to do. In a communist state like the old Soviet Union, central planners in Moscow issue millions of commands, deciding everything from how many tons of steel to produce in Siberia to where to build a dam on the Volga River. But what about a modern, complex economy like ours? Who's in charge? Who decides how many iPhones get made, how many cups of coffee are brewed in a city each morning, or how many pairs of shoes are shipped from Fiji to America? The answer is, No one. And this is where we meet the first great hero of our story, the price. Many people think of prices as obstacles, as annoying numbers that stop us from getting what we want. But Thomas Sowell wants us to see prices in a completely different light. Prices are not obstacles, they are messengers. They are signals that carry vital information across a vast, global network. Imagine you want to build a house. You need wood, steel, glass, and countless other materials. Each of those resources has thousands of other potential uses. The steel could be used to make a car, or a bridge, or a paperclip. The wood could be used for furniture, or paper, or a baseball bat. How does society decide where that steel or wood should go? It happens automatically through the price system. When you buy that wood and steel, you are bidding for it. You are competing with everyone else in the world who wants to use those same resources for something else. The price you pay is a reflection of how much others value those resources. If the demand for paper suddenly doubles, paper companies will start bidding up the price of wood. That higher price sends a signal, like a ripple spreading across a pond, throughout the entire economy. Furniture makers and baseball bat manufacturers will see the price of wood go up. They will then have to raise their prices to cover their costs. Some consumers, seeing the higher price for a wooden desk, might decide to buy a steel desk instead. Without any central planner giving orders, people all over the world start adjusting their behavior. They start conserving wood, because the price told them it has become more scarce, or more highly valued by others. This process works in both directions. If a vast new deposit of iron ore is discovered, only a tiny fraction of the world's population will know about it. But everyone will soon discover that things made of steel are getting cheaper. The price is the messenger, delivering the good news to millions of people who can then adjust their choices accordingly. The last president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, once visited Britain and asked Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher a question that revealed the deep mystery of the market. He asked, "How do you see to it that people get food?" She replied that she didn't. Prices did that. Think of the monumental task of supplying a city like London or New York with the millions of tons of food it consumes every day. Every kind of fruit, vegetable, meat, and grain, from all corners of the world. In the Soviet system, this would require a massive bureaucracy of planners and officials, an army of people just to coordinate the logistics. In a market economy, it all happens without a central plan. Prices are the invisible coordinators. If there's a bad harvest in one part of the world, the price of that crop rises, signaling to farmers elsewhere that there's a greater demand. Greedy suppliers will then rush to get their food to that market first, to take advantage of the high prices. And in doing so, they rush food to the hungry far faster than any humanitarian mission with salaried employees probably could. Prices don't just guide consumers, they are crucial guides for producers. How does a car company know what features to put in a car? They don't know what millions of individuals want. All they know is that when they produce one kind of car, it sells at a profit. When they produce another, it sits on the lot. This brings us to another central idea. The market is a profit and loss system. We hear a lot about profits, often in a negative light. But losses are just as important for the health of the economy. A profit is a signal that a business is using resources in a way that consumers value. It's a reward for creating something people want, and for doing it efficiently. But a loss is a powerful, urgent signal. It tells a producer to stop. Stop making that product. Stop using those resources in that way, because consumers don't value the final output enough to cover its costs. Losses are what prevent a society from endlessly wasting its scarce resources on things people don't want. This is what happened in the Soviet Union. Without prices set by supply and demand, and without the discipline of profit and loss, there were chronic problems. Warehouses would be overflowing with goods that nobody wanted, while people stood in long lines for basic necessities that were in short supply. Two Soviet economists described a situation where the government set a high price for moleskins. Hunters, responding to the incentive, went out and trapped so many moles that all the warehouses were filled with pelts. But the industry couldn't use them all, and they just sat there and rotted. Meanwhile, the Central Planning Committee was too busy trying to keep track of 24 million other prices to fix the problem. In a market, this could never happen for long. The price of the surplus moleskins would have automatically fallen, signaling to hunters to stop trapping so many moles. The resources, the hunters' time and effort, would have automatically been redirected to something society needed more. So, we see that prices are the nervous system of an economy, transmitting information and coordinating the actions of millions. And the profit and loss system is the mechanism of discipline and reward that forces everyone to pay attention to those signals. But what happens when we try to interfere with this system? What happens when we decide that the message the prices are sending is unpleasant, and we try to shoot the messenger? This brings us to the crucial topic of price controls. Politicians often promise to make things more affordable by setting a legal limit on how high a price can go. This is called a price ceiling. The most common example is rent control. Let's go back to that story of the housing shortage in New York after World War II. The government had imposed rent control to keep housing cheap. On the surface, it seems like a kind and compassionate policy. But what were the consequences? First, think about demand. When the price of something is pushed down artificially, people want more of it. Under rent control, young adults who might have lived with their parents for another year decided to get their own apartment. People who might have had a roommate decided to live alone. Some people even kept a rent-controlled apartment in the city that they barely used, just as a convenient place to stay when visiting. All of this increased the quantity of housing demanded. But what about the supply? The supply of new housing dried up. Why would anyone build a new apartment building if the law prevents them from charging enough rent to cover their costs and make a profit? In Melbourne, Australia, for 9 years after rent control was imposed, not a single new apartment building was built. Even the supply of existing housing started to shrink. Landlords had no incentive to maintain their buildings. When you have a long line of people desperate for an apartment, you don't need to fix the leaky faucet or repaint the walls to attract a tenant. So, buildings began to deteriorate. Some landlords, finding that the cost of heat, hot water, and repairs exceeded the rent they were legally allowed to collect, simply walked away. They abandoned their buildings. And here we arrive at the terrible irony. In New York City, there were thousands of people sleeping on the streets, homeless, at the very same time that there were more than enough abandoned, boarded-up apartments to house every single one of them. The shortage wasn't a physical scarcity of housing, it was an artificial shortage created by a price control law that was intended to help. The good intentions led to disastrous consequences. Now, what about the opposite of a price ceiling? This is a price floor, which is a law that prevents a price from falling below a certain level. The most common examples are agricultural price supports and minimum wage laws. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, farmers were suffering terribly. The prices of their crops had fallen so low they couldn't pay their bills. So, the government stepped in to help by setting price floors for farm products, guaranteeing a higher price than the market would offer. What happens when you set a price higher than what people are willing to pay? You get a surplus. And that's exactly what happened. The government had to buy up the massive surpluses of food that farmers produced but couldn't sell to the public at the artificially high prices. And what did they do with this food? At a time when millions of Americans were suffering from malnutrition, the government deliberately destroyed it. They bought and destroyed 6 million hogs in 1 year. They had farmers plow perfectly good crops back into the ground. They poured enormous amounts of milk down the sewers. Why? To keep the food off the market so that the high price could be maintained. This sounds insane, but it's the logical consequence of a price floor. A surplus doesn't mean there's too much food relative to the population. It means there's too much food relative to what people are willing and able to buy at the government-mandated price. The same tragic story is played out in India, where the government has mountains of rotting wheat in storage while millions of its people don't have enough to eat. This same principle of a price floor applies to the minimum wage. A minimum wage law makes it illegal to pay a worker less than a certain amount per hour. For workers whose productivity is high enough to be worth that wage, the law has no effect. But for a young, inexperienced, or low-skilled worker whose labor might only be worth, say, $8 an hour to an employer, a law that says you must pay him $10 an hour makes him unaffordable. The result is a surplus of labor, which we call unemployment. The employer doesn't hire him, not out of greed, but because it would be a losing proposition. So the real minimum wage is always zero. That's the wage a person gets when they can't find a job at all because a law has priced them out of the market. And this is why unemployment rates are consistently highest among the young and the low-skilled, the very people minimum wage laws are supposed to help. Switzerland, a country with no minimum wage law, has for years had one of the lowest unemployment rates in the world, often around 3%. So we see that both trying to hold prices down and trying to push them up can have severe, counterproductive consequences. It disrupts the communication network of the economy and leads to misallocations of scarce resources. Now let's turn our attention from the market as a whole to the key players within it, businesses. We often think of businesses as static institutions, but Sowell paints a picture of constant, churning change. He tells the story of the Aldi grocery chain, which in 1929 was the largest retailer of any kind in the entire world, with 15,000 stores. Today, it's virtually gone. What happened? Aldi rose to dominance by being incredibly efficient, which allowed it to charge lower prices than its competitors. But then the world changed. After World War II, Americans began moving to the suburbs. They had cars and refrigerators. They no longer needed a small neighborhood store they could walk to every day. They could drive to a large supermarket once a week and stock up. Supermarkets had huge advantages. They could buy in bulk, get lower delivery costs, and operate with greater efficiency. New chains like Safeway understood this shift and built their businesses around it. Aldi, the old giant, was slow to adapt. It clung to its old model of small stores in urban neighborhoods for too long. And so, it began to bleed customers and money, eventually shrinking into a shadow of its former self. This story is not unique. Pan American Airways, which pioneered flights across the oceans, went bankrupt. Smith Corona, which made typewriters, couldn't survive the age of the computer. Eastman Kodak, the king of photography for a century, sold 90% of all film in America in 1976. But it missed the digital revolution, a technology its own engineers had invented, and was forced into bankruptcy. The market is relentless. The profits that reward success and the losses that punish failure are what force businesses to constantly adapt to changing realities and to serve the consumer better. It's a process of constant creative destruction. And the ultimate beneficiary is not any one company, but all of us, the consumers, who get better products at lower prices. This process highlights one of the most important and scarce resources in any economy: knowledge. Not just academic knowledge, but the practical, on-the-ground knowledge of millions of different people about their own circumstances, preferences, and opportunities. A central planner in a government office cannot possibly know all of the things that are known by all the people in an economy. How can they know the best location for a new grocery store in a town they've never visited, or how to best arrange the items on the shelves? This is why entrepreneurs are so vital. They are the ones who are constantly experimenting, trying new things, seeking out and applying knowledge that no one else has. Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart, didn't start with a grand theory. He started as a clerk in a J.C. Penney store and learned the retail business from the ground up. He built his empire by obsessively focusing on efficiency, on cutting costs, and passing those savings on to the customer. He was tapping into a particular kind of knowledge that could not be taught in a university. And in a market economy, he didn't have to ask anyone for permission. He just had to deliver the goods at a lower price. The success that followed forced his giant competitors, like Sears, to try to imitate him or risk extinction. This is the genius of a market system. It harnesses the scarce and scattered knowledge of millions of individuals and provides incentives for them to use that knowledge for the benefit of others, even if their own motive is simply to make a profit. Now, let's bring this down to the individual level. Why are some people paid so much more than others? We often hear about the astronomical pay of CEOs or movie stars and feel a sense of unfairness. But pay is not some arbitrary number. It is a price, the price of labor. And like all prices, it is determined by supply and demand. It's not just about how hard you work, it's about how much value your work adds to the production of goods and services that other people are willing to pay for. This is called productivity. An engineer is paid more than a messenger, not because he is a better person, but because the supply of people who can do what he does is much smaller, and the value he adds to a company's earnings is much greater. But an individual's productivity isn't just about their own skill. It's also about the capital they work with and the management that organizes their work. An American worker might be paid 10 times as much as a worker in a poor country, but if he is working with 10 times the capital equipment in a highly efficient factory, he can produce more than 10 times the output. In that case, the American worker actually has lower labor costs per unit of output. This is why the high-wage fallacy, the idea that high-wage countries can't compete with low-wage countries, is a myth. Historically, it has always been the high-wage, high-productivity countries like Britain and the United States that have been the world's greatest exporters. Another powerful myth Sowell dismantles is the idea of a static rich and poor. We constantly hear statistics about the top 1% or the bottom 20%, but these statistics are often deeply misleading because they are snapshots of income brackets, not movies of the lives of actual people. Most people don't stay in the same income bracket their whole lives. Think about your own life. When you're a teenager with a part-time job, you're in a very low income bracket. As you gain education, skills, and experience, your income rises. You may reach your peak earning years in your 40s or 50s, putting you in a much higher bracket. Then, when you retire, your income falls again. Studies that actually follow the same individuals over time paint a picture of incredible upward mobility. One study from the University of Michigan found that of the working Americans who were in the bottom 20% of income in 1975, 95% of them were out of that bracket by 1991. Not only that, but 29% of them had risen all the way to the top 20%. An IRS study that followed taxpayers from 1996 to 2005 found that the income of those who started in the bottom 20% had, on average, increased by 91% over that decade. Meanwhile, the income of those who started in the top 1% had actually fallen by 26%. There is tremendous turnover at the top and tremendous movement up from the bottom. The categories of the rich and the poor are constantly being populated by different people. This doesn't mean that real poverty doesn't exist. It does. But the narrative of a fixed class structure, of a permanent divide between haves and have-nots, is largely a statistical illusion. Finally, let's zoom out to the biggest picture of all, the international economy. Why do countries trade with each other? For the same reasons individuals do. To get something they want at a lower cost than it would take to produce it themselves. There are two key principles here. The first is absolute advantage. This is the easy one. Americans buy bananas from Honduras because it's a tropical country where bananas can be grown far more cheaply than they could be in, say, Minnesota. Honduras has an absolute advantage in banana production. But what if one country is better at producing everything? What if America can produce both computers and clothes more efficiently than a developing nation? Should it still trade? The answer is yes. And the reason is the beautiful and powerful principle of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is not about being the best at everything. It's about what you give up to produce something. The real cost of producing a computer is the clothes you could have produced with the same time, labor, and resources. Sowell uses a simple analogy. Imagine a brilliant eye surgeon who also happens to be a very fast car washer. He can wash a car in less time than the young man he hires at the local car wash. Should the surgeon wash his own car? Of course not. The time he would spend washing his car is time he is not spending performing surgery, where he earns hundreds or thousands of dollars an hour. Even though the surgeon has an absolute advantage in both surgery and car washing, the young man at the car wash has a comparative advantage in washing cars, because he is giving up far less to do it. The same is true for nations. Even if the United States is more efficient at producing both computers and clothes, it will have a comparative advantage in one of them, say, computers. The developing nation will have a comparative advantage in the other, clothes. Both countries will be richer if the U.S. specializes in making computers and trades them for clothes made in the other country. The total output of both goods increases for the world as a whole. This principle ensures that there is a place for every nation in the global economy, no matter how poor, because every nation can produce something at a lower opportunity cost than other nations. This is why, for over a century, Britain did not grow enough food to feed its own people. It focused on what it did best: manufacturing, shipping, finance, and used the wealth from those industries to buy food from countries that had a comparative advantage in agriculture. The British people were far better off than if their country had tried to be self-sufficient in food. So, if trade is so beneficial, why do we see so many restrictions on it, like tariffs and quotas? Because while trade benefits the country as a whole, it can harm specific industries that are less efficient than their foreign competitors. When cheaper, better-made cars are imported, it's great for car buyers. But it's painful for the domestic car companies and their workers who are losing business and jobs. These groups are organized, visible, and vocal. They lobby the government for protection. But this protection comes at a huge cost to everyone else. When the U.S. government put restrictions on imported steel to save jobs in the American steel industry, it raised the price of steel for every other American industry that uses it, from car makers to construction companies. These industries then became less competitive, and it's estimated that for every one job saved in the steel industry, 3 jobs were lost in other industries. This brings us to the end of our journey through the core ideas of basic economics. What we have discovered is not a set of complex formulas, but a way of thinking. A way of thinking that begins with scarcity and choice, that sees prices as messengers, that understands the discipline of profit and loss, and that always asks the most important question in economics: and then what? It's a way of thinking that looks beyond the immediate, visible effects of any action or policy and considers the long-run, indirect, and often unseen consequences for everyone. It is the application of structured common sense. And as Thomas Sowell shows us, that kind of common sense is one of the most powerful tools we have for understanding the world and for making it a better place. Commentary. So, after this journey through the world of economics with Thomas Sowell as our guide, what is the great lesson we should take away? If I had to boil it all down to one single idea, it would be this: economics is the study of cause and effect. It's about understanding that our actions have consequences, and that those consequences often ripple out in ways we don't expect. Sowell's great gift is to teach us to look past our intentions and focus on the incentives that our actions create. We may intend for rent control to provide affordable housing, but if the incentive it creates is for landlords to stop building and maintaining apartments, the consequence will be a housing crisis. We may intend for a minimum wage to lift people out of poverty, but if the incentive it creates is for employers to hire fewer low-skilled workers, the consequence will be unemployment. This is why Sowell often says that economics is about trade-offs, not solutions. There are no perfect answers. In a world of scarcity, every choice involves giving something up. The question is not how to create a perfect world, but how to make the best possible trade-offs among the available alternatives. This way of thinking is incredibly empowering, especially for a young person today. You are constantly bombarded with messages from politicians, from the media, from activists, all telling you that they have the solution to society's problems. They speak in terms of goals: we want a living wage, fair prices, or to save jobs. Basic economics gives you the tools to look past those goals and analyze the policies being proposed. It allows you to ask the tough questions. You can ask, what incentives does this policy create? Who will pay the costs? What are the likely consequences, not just tomorrow, but next year, and 10 years from now? This is not a cynical way of looking at the world. It's a realistic one. It's an understanding that we cannot simply command the world to be as we wish it to be. We have to work within the constraints of reality. The market, for all its imperfections, is a powerful mechanism for doing that. It is a process that allows millions of people to cooperate peacefully, to signal their needs and desires to one another, and to harness the vast, scattered knowledge of society in a way that no central planner could ever hope to replicate. So, what can you do with this knowledge, starting today? Let me offer 3 simple practices. First, whenever you hear a proposal to solve a social problem, practice asking that crucial question, and then what? Don't just think about stage 1, the immediate and visible effect. Try to think about stage 2, stage 3, and all the unseen ripple effects that might follow. Second, start paying attention to prices as messengers. When you see the price of gasoline go up, don't just see it as a personal inconvenience. Ask yourself, what information is this price trying to tell me? Is there a disruption in supply somewhere in the world? Is demand increasing in a rapidly growing country like China or India? See it as a piece of a giant, global puzzle. Third, be skeptical of the zero-sum mindset. The idea that for one person to win, another must lose. This is the fallacy at the heart of so many destructive ideas, from protectionism to class warfare. Remember that in a system of voluntary exchange, both sides must benefit, or the transaction wouldn't happen. Wealth is not a fixed pie to be divided, it is created. That was a summary of Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell. We've explored the core principles today, but I have to be honest with you. A summary can only give you a map of the territory. The real treasure is found when you walk the path yourself. The true power of this book lies in the quiet moments of reading, when a simple story or a clear analogy suddenly illuminates a corner of the world you'd never understood before. This summary is meant to help you decide if this book deserves your time. If anything we've discussed has sparked your curiosity, if you feel that desire to see the world with greater clarity, then I urge you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just an act of learning, it's an experience that can fundamentally change the way you think about your life and the world around you. A link to the book is in the description below. Also, if this journey through a great mind has been valuable to you, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's continue to learn and grow together.